Germany is falling. Once the all-powerful country, now being crushed in the Second World War. Adolf Hitler is in hiding. The feared dictator no longer publicly supports his people. The man that fueled this chaos, leaving the country to crumble. 28 feet underground, the men and women who until now were proud of what they'd done. Now, they hide in fear of what their fate will be once the war's over.
There were lots of plots to kill Hitler, and of course, today we wish at least just one of them had actually worked. But no, there were lots, and he survived so many that it made Hitler feel that he really did have this kind of divine providence behind him that made him survive.
Eva Braun refuses to leave his side. With no hope left, they will never see their beloved Berlin the same.
This is a war brought about by Hitler, and this is a war that Hitler has fought for too long, and he's fighting it to the death. And he's fighting it to the death of the people who he supposedly loves.
Adolf Hitler was once the most powerful dictator and leader Germany had ever seen. His charisma and ability to influence a nation carried him into power in 1933.
On the 30th of January 1933, Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany, but of a coalition government. So there were just 3 Nazi posts in that coalition government.
It's very tempting to think that when Hitler comes to power in early 1933, that his grip on power is absolutely total. In fact, he has a very uneven, shaky start. He's still quite worried about public opinion. So what he does is a mixture of passing various laws that give him more and more power, like the Enabling Act, that actually makes him immensely powerful. But also, he takes advantage of various events like the Reichstag fire, in which the German Parliament building burns down. Now, it's highly likely, but never proven, whether the Nazis actually burnt it down themselves. But certainly, in a sense, it doesn't matter. What happens is that Hitler and the Nazis took advantage of the Reichstag burning down to show that there was a communist plot against what the Nazis described as still being a democratic government. And it enabled them to seize more power, by emergency decree.
Very quickly, he turned Germany into a one-party state. So first of all, he made sure to eliminate the influence and power of the German political left. So the Socialist Party and the Communist Party, for a start, were banned. But over a short amount of time as well, the Nazi Party was the only legal party too.
And eventually, in January 33, he becomes Chancellor. Now, don't forget, Chancellor in Germany, and this still remains today, is not, at the time, the head of state. The head of state is the president. So it's the Chancellor, though, who has the real executive power. In order to take as much power as he can, he's also going to have to make himself head of state. And that really becomes an opportunity for him when Hindenburg dies, and he's able to take on the role of both president and chancellor and kind of create this new role for himself, and that is the role of Führer, the German word for leader. That is a fascist term, be in no doubt. This is a kind of new form of governance that Germany now has. Other parties are banned. The only party allowed is the Nazi Party. This has become a totalitarian state, and Hitler can say to the German people, you voted for it. It's a con, and it's a con that worked.
With a God complex drilled into his mind, Hitler saw himself as the only leader Germany ever needed. He used democracy to build popularity, but had every intention of destroying it. Hitler begins by establishing his ideas of an Aryan race, the pure master race of Germans who are to follow strict reproducing laws, sterilizing people who have hereditary traits he deems unacceptable, that don't match the master race principle.
You have a lot of laws being passed, unsurprisingly, to give the Nazis more power. But also you've got a rise in the apparatus of state terror. You have a thing called the Gestapo, now completely notorious, but that stands for secret state police. This is a new police force. There's already the Kripo, the criminal police. But this is a new type of policeman. It's a policeman who is in plain clothes. It's a policeman who recruits informers, on every block, on every street, and every block of flats, in order for the people to effectively police themselves. And of course, this becomes an incredibly important part of the Nazi apparatus.
October 1933. Hitler withdraws Germany from the League of Nations in order to enforce his ideas drawn up in Lebensraum, and with the intent to rebuild the German army.
He had the idea of a very aggressive and expansionist foreign policy, and essentially this idea of might over morality, so force over anything rational, I suppose, in a way, force in terms of foreign affairs. And of course, the League of Nations was designed to promote peace and to enhance international relations and security, of course, too. And so this was why Hitler wanted to remove Germany from it. And in addition, this was then going to allow him to start to tear up the Treaty of Versailles in the way that he had hoped and intended all along.
Hitler's being expansionist. He wants more territory. He's looking to Czechoslovakia, to an area called the Sudetenland, where he's identified people who he thinks should rightfully be Germans. And he thinks that those people should be part of the new Nazi Germany. He, of course, is also looking east towards Poland and thinking, maybe I want a bit of that. And he's also, of course, looking down to Austria, which, of course, is a German-speaking country, and thinking, maybe I want to have Austria as part of my new kingdom, if you like. So it's a mixture of slowly absorbing more power into himself, but also then using that power to go out and grab more land.
The German people had full support for Hitler, unaware of the horrors to unfold during his reign of terror. On September 1st, 1939, Hitler launched an attack on Poland, underestimating the start of World War II. For the first time, foreign leaders became aware of how insane Hitler really was.
In September 39, Hitler invades Poland, along with Stalin. Stalin also, Soviet Russia, also invades Poland at the same time. But what the world remembers is the fact that Hitler invaded Poland, and a couple of days later, the British declare war on Germany. But Hitler's advance through Poland was really quick. It was lightning quick. And actually, the German word blitzkrieg literally means lightning war.
Hitler divulged a concept called blitzkrieg, a lightning war, to his German public. Hitler himself claimed it to be a war of racial annihilation. No mercy is to be upheld.
The German population, because of Hitler's popularity, and even though they had experienced the horrors of the First World War and the trench warfare of the First World War and all of the shell shock and everything that went with it, because he was so popular, they might have been delighted to go to war in September 1939, but they went along with it.
Within just 6 weeks, Poland was crushed by the German army and tens of thousands of Poles executed. The 2 million Jews living in Poland now find themselves under German rule. Their fate is uncertain, but it doesn't look bright. Anyone inferior to the Aryan race does not deserve the mercy of Germany.
So we know that from as early as Hitler's writings in Mein Kampf that he was personally anti-Semitic. And what we see once the Third Reich comes into power is his personal anti-Semitism translated into state policy. So from the very earliest days and months of the Third Reich, there were many different measures, legal measures taken against the Jews, and also illegal measures as well.
Just as he had promised in Mein Kampf, Hitler is treating the Jews in Germany as an internal enemy. So what you see are laws stripping Jews of their German citizenship, You see awful things like Jews not being allowed to go to swimming pools, because if a Jew swam in a public swimming pool, the water would have to be drained because the Jew had dirtied the water. So you can see that you've got this sort of awful both political and cultural exclusion of the Jewish community.
Back in Germany, the citizens are under the impression that Germany is all great and all powerful. Hitler's most evil plans are still yet to be realized.
Hitler is always mindful of public opinion. I think that it's always important to remember that Hitler, does always worry about what the German people think about him. He doesn't just sort of seize power in 1933 and then not care. He wants to be liked, he wants to be popular, he is a political leader after all, and all political leaders, democratic or fascist or otherwise, want to be liked. Now, the best way to make yourself liked is to project an image that the people can identify with or respect or admire. And what he does is he uses propaganda and photography and film to show him as this kind of almost sort of messianic figure.
With the German people feeling positive and patriotic, focusing on the war, Hitler can now enforce his most brutal horrors of the Third Reich.
The Nazi regime absolutely hated the Jews and wanted to get rid of them from the very beginning. So we see that with some of the earlier policies, but as we get into the wartime period, of course, the policies become more and more radicalized, more and more extreme. So this idea, essentially the Nazis created this idea of a Jewish question or a Jewish problem that needed a solution. And throughout the course of the Third Reich, they put into place a variety of different measures to try to deal with their so-called Jewish problem.
Hitler's plans for the Jews and when he decided to slaughter them still remain a topic of a lot of historical controversy, because there is no piece of paper that says "kill all Jews" signed A. Hitler. But I think that what is absolutely clear is that in conversation he would have said to his top leaders, we need to start killing these people. Hitler was smart enough to know this shouldn't be on a piece of paper. The initial idea is that the Jews are rounded up into ghettos, and from those ghettos they can then be sent to concentration camps where they can be worked to death. And you see these camps all over occupied Poland and all over Germany itself. Suddenly, around the time of Barbarossa, 1941, it starts to get actually eliminationist. And you have what's called Action Reinhardt, in which you got the establishment of 4 actual death camps in what was occupied Poland.
In secret, Hitler's inner circle are experimenting with other forms of mass murder to be deemed more efficient. This is known as the final solution.
The Wannsee Conference really was that moment, a kind of very important moment in the evolution of Nazi anti-Semitic policy and in what we call the final solution, because this was the moment that both retrospectively sanctioned what had already been going on, these experiments at the end of 1941, and really set in place then the momentum for the establishment and running of these death camps. And there were 6 of those, all of them on Polish soil through the height of the war. The Germans were involved, in their own experience of the war, preoccupied with their own difficulties, and in a sense then once the Jews weren't there anymore, they were sort of out of their frame of reference and just not in their thoughts.
Jews from all over Europe are transported to these camps, unaware of the inhumane scenarios they are about to face. Horror, screams, mass murder, an unimaginable scene of death and destruction. Millions of Jews were murdered because of one man's horrific desire for a racially pure nation.
Death camps, all of those were on Polish soil, so they were out of the immediate frame of sight or reference of the Germans. So again, in some way, they were happening elsewhere and not really in their immediate field of vision.
These are places that are places of deep, deep horror, because you didn't go there to work, you went there to die. And you would arrive, and within 30 minutes, you'd be dead. Treblinka, for example, is no bigger, if you visit it, than a football stadium, the size of a football pitch. And in that very small area, around 850,000 men, women and children were gassed. It's just the most horrific thought if you ever visit a place like that. Auschwitz, again, a very huge, iconic place associated with the Holocaust, of course, famously where 1 million Jews were put to death, many of whom were gassed on arrival. But it also was a concentration camp rather than just an extermination camp. So it has these two horrific roles. And don't forget, Auschwitz and places like this, they're huge. Auschwitz is 3 camps spread over about 10 miles. I mean, these are factories of death. There's no doubt about it.
In 1940, Hitler's all-powerful army ruled over Denmark, Norway, Holland, and Belgium, and eventually crushes France with their number of tanks.
Really, one of the high points of Hitler's popularity was the image of the Nazis taking over Paris. So all of these attacks were very sort of quick and easy victories for the Nazis, and they just fed Hitler's success and popularity.
Hitler and his Nazi stormtroopers marched into Paris as France fell. And for the German Führer, the United Kingdom, only separated by the English Channel, became his next target. When the battle for Britain began, a Germany victory was far from being a foregone conclusion, despite the superiority of Hitler's air force, the Luftwaffe. Hitler had underestimated his enemy. Hitler was shocked when the British Royal Air Force bombed Berlin on August 25, 1940. Although causing little damage, it lowered morale considerably. Hitler sought revenge by bombing Britain day and night. However, by focusing on the cities rather than the airfield, the RAF had time to recover, and the Nazis lost their advantage before even realizing they had it. There would suddenly be a change in the course of the war in Europe, as Hitler made a surprising decision to turn his attention eastwards to the Soviet Union, planning an attack on Joseph Stalin, with whom he'd agreed a non-aggression pact at the beginning of the war. Hitler was about to make a grave error, as his hate for the communists without doubt clouded his judgment. On June 22, 1941, he gathered together a vast army on the Eastern Front, ready to attack Stalin's notorious Red Army. The Führer had given specific orders following Operation Barbarossa just days earlier that they should attack with extreme brutality.
In August 1939, just before the Second World War broke out, an alliance was made between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. And this seems very strange because we've already said how Hitler hated anything to do with Bolshevism, communism, and indeed the USSR was his ultimate enemy. The idea of eradicating socialism and Bolshevism from the earth was one of Hitler's main priorities. So it seemed a bit anomalous that they would make a pact like that. But of course, he was just trying to pave the way and make the circumstance right for the war and the situation in Poland, so it would be easy, as the attack on Poland was. But then we saw as well how Hitler's very happy to tear up a treaty when it doesn't suit him. So on the 22nd of June 1941, the Nazis invaded the USSR with Operation Barbarossa.
Stalin's had this pact with Hitler for years, and he's thinking Hitler's never going to invade. Oh dear. Hitler goes straight in, June 1941, and again the Blitzkrieg, Operation Barbarossa as it was called in this instance, was tremendously successful, and initially the forces just went through Russia like a knife through butter.
By October, the onset of a bitter winter was able to dash Hitler's hopes of a swift occupation. Hitler had guaranteed a victory within 6 months, but as more of his troops were killed or severely wounded, even Goebbels' propaganda machine could not hide the fact that all was not going to plan. Many began to despair. and even Germany's greatest heroes began to lose hope. It wasn't long before Hitler had a lot more to worry about. On December 7th, 1941, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, killing thousands of American soldiers, giving the USA great reason to enter the war. On December 8th, President Roosevelt declared war on Japan. America, the slumbering giant, was now a major player in the conflict, not only ready to take on the Japanese, but also Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany as well. The American army were well supplied and prepared for battle, with great machines to produce enough weapons and combat for their army and allies. With America, Britain, and Russia forming an unlikely union, they now had the ultimate power to put a stop to the fearsome German dictator. The German nation now faced an enemy of a much greater scale than Hitler's supporters had ever imagined. Having signed the tripartite pact with Japan and Italy the year before, Hitler was now compelled to honor the agreement. Just 4 days later, Hitler declared war on America. It soon became all too clear that Adolf Hitler had seriously miscalculated the strength of his enemies, and with America, Russia, and Great Britain now united against him, the Allies were without doubt ready to fight back. Those who had for so long supported Hitler were now living in fear that it was all about to collapse. On the Russian plains, as the battle in Moscow failed to go Hitler's way, the Führer began to make increasingly radical decisions as he refused to accept defeat. He announced no retreat from the Russian front near Moscow, which only lost him the faith of his once loyal generals. Winston Churchill arranged a meeting with Stalin to discuss plans to defeat the Germans. He explained that if they could end the year with possession of North Africa, then Hitler's reign over Europe would be threatened. They planned to invade Italy and then an eventual invasion of France. Stalin agreed and assured Churchill his Soviet troops would hold off the German army for the winter. However, German troops were just 50 miles from Stalingrad, hundreds of thousands strong. This was more than just another battle. Hitler hated the Soviets with a passion, instilling in his commanders and troops that the Russians were their inferiors, therefore to have no mercy. On August 23, 1942, the Luftwaffe hit the city of Stalingrad with a huge air bombardment, killing thousands. After weeks of bombing, Stalingrad was reduced to rubble. In September 1942, the German 6th Army began the battle for Stalingrad on ground. It would become one of the most brutal battles of the war. After 3 months of carnage, the slow and costly advance by German 6th Army forced the Soviets to split into 2 sections of battle. Hitler was literally on the verge of the victory he had dreamed of, but the freezing winds of the Russian winter caused a thick fog to absorb the city, meaning the Luftwaffe couldn't keep up supplies to troops on the ground, and the tide was already turning. The situation continued to grow in Russia's favor, and soon the Soviets had the city of Stalingrad surrounded. The German 6th Army were trapped, and thousands began to die of frostbite, malnutrition, and disease. On January 8, 1943, the Russians offered the German army in Stalingrad the opportunity to surrender, but Hitler told them they must fight until the last bullet. The German soldiers realized their welfare was being sacrificed in a bitter fight they couldn't win, losing faith in their Führer. As more ground was lost to the Russians, terms of surrender were offered once more. Again, Hitler refused to accept defeat. Soviet forces quickly closed in on the defeated Germans. On February 2nd, over 90,000 survivors became captive. They were all that remained of the original 220,000-strong German Sixth Army. Support in Germany was now faltering for the Nazi cause. Stalingrad was their biggest defeat and dealt a huge blow to German morale. Resistance to Hitler and his henchmen began to grow, and Hitler's mental stage also began to deteriorate. This caused the Führer to withdraw from the public gaze. January 16th, 1945. Adolf Hitler's world shrinks to a few concrete rooms underground. An air raid shelter, located near the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, becomes the Führer's new residence. Knowing of his intentions to make this his home, the bunker is decorated with high-quality furniture and expensive art taken from the Reich Chancellery itself. The bunker complex was entirely self-contained. However, as it was below the water table, the conditions were unpleasantly damp. Adolf Hitler and his closest associates decide the time has come to retreat underground, controlling the country from below. Joseph Goebbels and his family also make the decision to move below ground to be alongside their beloved Führer.
Joseph Goebbels is the Nazi propaganda minister. So he's in charge of cinema, books, the nascent TV industry. He's in charge of all the methods of communication. And so he's in charge of getting the Nazi message out, effectively. And now he is married to a very sort of striking blonde woman called Magda. Now Magda has been married before to a very wealthy German industrialist, but she eventually gets divorced and marries Joseph Goebbels, who was a real Casanova, actually. Even though he was short, club-footed, and not an attractive man, he had a lot of sexual conquests.
Hitler handpicks a select few of SS officers to accompany him into the bunker and act as his personal bodyguards, also keeping him informed of what is happening above. A telephone switchboard is secured for contact with the army headquarters, relaying orders to the soldiers fighting Hitler's war above. Martin Bormann, Hitler's powerful and feared secretary, also has an office within the bunker, maintaining his control and position as one of Hitler's closest associates.
Martin Bormann is one of the most enigmatic and cryptic figures of the Third Reich. He was one of the kind of old fighters, as it was called. He was kind of there from the very early days. Very loyal Nazi, but always in the shadows. He was head of what was called the Chancellery, and as a result, he actually had the kind of keys to Hitler, if you liked. If you want to go and speak to Hitler, you got to go through Bormann. It doesn't matter who you are, everyone's got to go through Bormann. And so that gives him enormous power, because if he can say you can and you can't, you've got to carry favour with him. And of course, in any dictatorship, whoever's the nearest to the dictator is going to have the most power after the dictator.
Conference rooms are a major part of the bunker, a place for the men to gather and discuss the military situation and how to progress with the war. Hitler dictates from 28 feet under. His words no longer carry the strength and willpower that they did before. The Red Army are fast approaching, and with no clear eyes on the front line, Hitler and his associates are unaware of the severity of the situation.
Once the Red Army came into German territory in 1945, then Hitler's position as this infallible ruler and leader really not only became to be called into question, but really came to its end. Because the Soviet troops were very vengeful. They were retaliating for all the terrible brutalities and atrocities that the Nazis and the German army had put into place in Soviet territory.
Life in the bunker is delusional. Everyone pretending that Germany is winning the war. Everyone ignoring the reality that their empire is crumbling above them. April 20th, 1945. Hitler makes his last public appearance before returning to his concrete coffin, the bunker. He hands out medals to the Hitler Youth for their dedication to the fight and offers words of encouragement for continuing to battle. Soviet forces are fighting their way through the city, aiming for the Reichstag, meters away from Hitler's bunker. With the odds stacked so heavily against them, the German defense in Berlin cannot last much longer. The Führer's beloved Germany is falling to the artillery and fire of the Soviet forces, an army he believed he could destroy. By now, in the bunker, a deranged Hitler is grasping at any ideas he thinks might change the tide in the war. Refusing to accept the army is faulting, he orders more and more attacks on the enemy, deep down, knowing they can only fail. After hearing of the state Berlin is in, Hitler suffers a major mental breakdown, ranting and shouting at everyone around him, before surprisingly declaring the war is lost. Morale in the bunker is at an all-time low. Eva throws parties with the secretaries and SS men, drinking and dancing to forget the fatal position they are in.
Eva Braun is one of the more sort of kind of enigmatic figures of the Third Reich, if you like, because she was very much kept in the background by Hitler, because Hitler was very keen not to lose favour with German women by seeming, by cutting himself off with his own wife or a girlfriend.
Hitler begins thinking about suicide. He consults a doctor on the best way to take his own life, coming to the conclusion he will bite down on a cyanide capsule whilst shooting himself in the head. Who would have thought this forceful dictator would retreat to the shell of a man, insane and desperately looking for a way out? In November 1943, the Allies increased their attacks, targeting the capital of Berlin with a fierce bombardment. National monuments were obliterated, and it was clear that Hitler's war was now turning in favor of the Allies.
This is a war brought about by Hitler, and this is a war that Hitler has fought for too long, and he's fighting it to the death. And he's fighting it to the death of the people who he supposedly loves, and he no longer loves them by the end of the war. And he says that basically the German people don't deserve him, the German people don't deserve Germany, and everybody should fight to the death because basically, they don't deserve to be alive because they failed him. Classic narcissistic thinking. The world is for him, and he's not there for the world.
In June 1944, the Allies were closing in. The Soviets had cleared the Nazis from Russia and were heading towards Germany. The resistance knew they had to act quickly. Goebbels increased propaganda, hoping to enthuse the public to defend the fatherland. But as Berlin was increasingly targeted, it became ever clear to the rebels among the citizens that the only way to end the war was to kill Hitler. In July of 1944, some resistance is developing within Hitler's own supporters after they're beginning to realize he is full of empty promises. An attempt is made on Hitler's life as a bomb is planted inside a briefcase under the desk in one of his meetings.
There were lots of plots to kill Hitler, and of course, today we wish at least just one of them had actually worked.
This was codenamed Operation Valkyrie. So on the 20th of July 1944, Count von Stauffenberg made a serious attempt on the Führer's life by bringing a bomb into the briefing room where Hitler was, placing it under his desk and hoping the intention of Operation Valkyrie was that it would kill Hitler.
And they don't want to get rid of Hitler because he's evil. That may be part of it. They want to get rid of Hitler because they think he's fighting the war badly. And they just are fed up with him. And indeed, Hitler is fighting the war badly because he's a terrible, terrible strategist. Bomb goes off and the whole building is basically destroyed. There's no way anybody can survive. But miracle upon miracle, Hitler survives because this oak table is so heavy, so over-engineered, that actually it absorbs so much of the blast that Hitler gets away with, I think, a perforated eardrum, some torn trousers, and a bit of shock. This is a really, really devastating blow for any resistance in the Third Reich. It comes just a month and a bit after D-Day, and of course, as the Allied forces, both Russian, American, British, Canadian, French, punch their way into the heart of the Third Reich, the resistance never quite manages to take advantage of that.
With the failure of the assassination attempt, the Second World War continued for another year, claiming more lives and causing more chaos.
The first half of 1945 is probably the darkest 6 months in Germany's history because it's being invaded by the Russians, the Red Army from the east, and you've got the other allies coming through from the west. And it's the Russians who reach Berlin first. And when they reach Berlin, it's a city in rubble, it's a city in flames, it's a city in chaos. It's a city in which squads of marauding loyal Nazis are going around hanging people who are not taking part in the resistance to the city. It's a city in which you then got some Nazis committing suicide. It is the most benighted, appalling place you can imagine. And you've got the Soviet army literally raping and pillaging this city.
Hitler's image of an all-powerful dictator is slowly decreasing as his tremor gets worse.
Once the Red Army came into German territory in 1945, then Hitler's position as this infallible ruler and leader really not only became to be called into question, but really came to its end. Because the Soviet troops were very vengeful. They were retaliating for all the terrible brutalities and atrocities that the Nazis and the German army had put into place in Soviet territory. What it meant was that they were coming closer and closer on their journey westwards to Berlin, and eventually Hitler and a very small inner circle around him had to retreat to his bunker, his underground bunker.
The Third Reich's days were numbered. Berlin was left virtually unprotected as the Red Army advanced towards Hitler's headquarters from the east, as the Americans marched in from the west. The Allies were winning. On April 20th, 1945, Hitler's birthday, Soviet artillery began to shell the center of Berlin. Goebbels' propaganda slogans were sprawled across buildings, encouraging a fight against the Red Army. However, terrified by the approaching Red Army, many of the citizens of Berlin began to flee. Many had given up hope, waving white flags in hopes of surrender, or committing suicide to end their suffering. Hitler's dreams of a 1,000-year Reich had crumbled. As the fight of a hopeless battle continued for Germans, Hitler and his closest associates continued to hide below. April 27, 1945. Berlin is surrounded by Soviet troops, fighting into the government district. April 28, 1945. Hitler learns of Heinrich Himmler's plans to make a peace deal with the Allies and surrender to the war. This is seen as the highest treason against the Führer, and he orders his arrest. However, Himmler has fled the country and is no longer contactable. Therefore, Hitler orders to speak with Hermann Fegelein, who is Himmler's representative in the bunker. Fegelein, who is married to Eva Braun's sister, Gretel, is nowhere to be found in the bunker. He is traced to his apartment, found with his mistress, drunk and with a suitcase of civilian clothes, planning an escape. Being brought back to the bunker to face the Führer's wrath, Fegelein is sentenced to death and shot. Also on this day, news arrives of the murder of Mussolini, dictator of Italy and Hitler's friend. Finding out he had been captured and shot, Hitler becomes determined not to allow this to become his own fate, and begins planning his suicide and the disposal of his body, to avoid it being publicly displayed by the Soviets.
Hitler's last days in the Führerbunker under the Reich Chancellery in the centre of Berlin, are a kind of terrible end of a Shakespearean tragedy, as the thunder of Russian artillery all around them, and they're deep inside this sort of concrete underground fortress. Everybody's sort of kind of going mad, and especially Hitler.
He turns to his secretary, Traudl Junge, and dictates his final will and testament. The short document stated that he had chosen death over capitulation, and he was to be cremated. He denied warmongering, expressed thanks to the loyal German citizens, and appealed to them to continue this struggle. April 29, 1945. Hitler has come to terms with the fact that Germany is losing the war and is beyond repair. His victories are long gone, needing a mixture of drugs to keep him sane. On this day, he finally agrees to marry long-term girlfriend Eva Braun.
Eva Braun represents everything that Hitler likes in women. He likes them to be a lot younger than him. He liked them to be, impressionable, easily led. They weren't going to challenge him in any way. He also likes them to be vivacious and bubbly, and he likes them to be very traditional. He doesn't want them to be, clever or in any way threatening or arguing with him about politics. He just wants them to be good little housefraus, back at home, doing church, children and cooking and not much more. And that's what Eva Braun represents. She's the kind of perfect Nazi girlfriend for Hitler. And so she's installed for a lot of the time in Hitler's house in the Bavarian Alps, in the Obersalzberg, this incredible kind of home he's got overlooking the most sort of beautiful scenery. And Eva Braun spends a lot of her time there. That's really out of the public view. You know, this is a real sort of kind of Nazi hidey hole, if you like. You know, it's very unclear as to what sort of relationship that Hitler actually had with Eva Braun. How sexualized it was, again, is impossible to say. But the fact is, it clearly was not a normal kind of relationship. It wasn't boyfriend and girlfriend. I suppose today we might call it arm candy in some way, but it wasn't public arm candy. So it's a sort of relationship that Hitler sort of thinks he should probably have to make him feel normal, but actually I don't think it's a relationship that Hitler really needs.
The pair tie the knot with what's left of Hitler's loyal advisors as witness in the bunker. Once the ceremony is over, Eva tries to begin celebrations, but everyone knows the end is near. Morale is low. Germany is doomed. Hitler will soon be dead. On the afternoon of April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler gathers his loyal advisors and shakes everyone's hand in silence. They know what is about to happen. Hitler takes his new wife into their private quarters. Handing her a cyanide capsule, equipped with his pistol, they sit beside each other and face their fate. Death. A gunshot is heard from outside the door. His bodyguards know what has happened. They remove the bodies and carry them up the stairs of the emergency exit into a small garden. Pouring petrol over their beloved Führer, the bodies are set on fire, then buried in a shallow bomb crater. Several others committed suicide in the bunker, not wanting to face their fate with the enemy. This is the end of Hitler's reign.
Very little of Hitler remains. There is a bit of jawbone in an archive in Moscow, the teeth of which absolutely match Hitler's dental records. So there's no doubt that Hitler died.
Just over a week later, Germany surrenders. As the death camps are uncovered, everyone learns the horrors of the Nazi regime.
On the 7th of May 1945, Germany surrendered. And once that had happened, the atrocities of the Nazi regime came to popular attention.
Ultimately, when it was shown quite how evil Nazism was and the German people fully appreciated it, then, yes, the opinion of Hitler was not quite so positive.
After the discovery of the horrific secrets of the Nazi regime, remaining important party members were arrested and set to face the judge in the Nuremberg trials. Hitler instilled some of the world's most evil policies and has gone down in history as the greatest evil to affect Europe.
It was very difficult for the German population to come to terms with what they found out about the Hitler regime after its demise. The Allied occupation from 1945 brought about the demilitarization, the denazification, and the re-education of Germans, and that was very important. But there were also the Nuremberg trials and a host of other post-war trials in which the leading Nazis, at least the ones who hadn't committed suicide, the leading Nazis were brought to trial. Again, this kind of brought to popular attention exactly what the evils of the regime had been. For successive generations of Germans, they've really struggled to come to terms with this very difficult aspect of their nation's past.
It's hard to say that there's a specific moment when we know that Germany got over the evil of Hitler's regime. There was no doubt that for many years, decades, a process of learning about your past has taken place in Germany. Of course, school children are taught today in Germany what was done in the name of the German people. I mean, there are two ways of looking at it. You can either say, the Germans were seized by this bunch of gangsters and then they abused the power that was given to them, or the Germans willingly gave these people this power. Certainly, there are a lot of reasons why you might have voted for Hitler in the 30s, not all of which involved you being evil. But certainly, if you were a fan of Hitler after the war still, and after all the revelations that had come out, then I would say you definitely are evil.
The ruins of both chancellery buildings were leveled by the Soviets between 1945 and 1949, as part of an effort to destroy the landmarks of Nazi Germany. The bunker largely survived, although some areas were partially flooded. In December 1947, the Soviets tried to destroy the bunker once again, attempting to blow it up, but only the separation walls were damaged. Government authorities wanted to destroy the last vestiges of these Nazi landmarks. The construction of buildings in the area around the Führerbunker was a strategy for ensuring the surroundings remained anonymous and unremarkable.